The conflict between Israel and Hamas is the latest chapter in a long and bloody struggle that has spanned decades and claimed countless lives. This ongoing battle is not just a political dispute, but a deeply rooted conflict with layers of historical, religious, and cultural significance. At its core, the conflict is rooted in competing claims to the same land, a land that both Israelis and Palestinians consider their ancestral home. This land, with its rich history and profound meaning, has been a focal point of contention for generations. The region is home to some of the world's most sacred religious sites, including the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Western Wall, which hold deep spiritual significance for both Muslims and Jews. These sites are not just places of worship but symbols of identity and heritage. The creation of Israel in 1948 led to the displacement of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, an event known as the Nakba, or catastrophe, in Arabic. This mass exodus left a lasting scar on the Palestinian people and has been a source of enduring resentment and grief. The 1948 Arab-Israeli War resulted in Israel gaining more territory than initially allocated by the United Nations, exacerbating tensions and leading to further conflicts in the years that followed. The war's aftermath saw significant demographic and territorial changes that continue to impact the region today. The Six-Day War in 1967 was another pivotal moment, with Israel capturing the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem. These territorial gains have been a major point of contention and have fueled ongoing disputes and hostilities. The Oslo Accords in the 1990s offered a glimmer of hope for peace, with both sides engaging in negotiations and signing agreements. However, despite the initial optimism, the accords ultimately faltered, and the peace process stalled, leading to renewed violence and mistrust. The rise of Hamas, an organization designated as a terrorist group by many countries, further complicated the situation. Hamas's militant activities and its refusal to recognize Israel's right to exist have been significant obstacles to peace. Hamas's control of Gaza after 2006 led to an Israeli blockade, which has severely impacted the living conditions in the region. The blockade has resulted in a humanitarian crisis, with shortages of essential supplies and widespread poverty affecting the daily lives of Gazans. Understanding this historical context is crucial for comprehending the current situation and the challenges in achieving peace. The conflict is deeply entrenched, with each side holding on to its narrative and grievances. Only by acknowledging and addressing these complex issues can there be any hope for a lasting resolution. On October 7, 2023, a meticulously planned surprise attack by Hamas militants shattered the fragile peace along the Gaza-Israel border. The assault, beginning on a Jewish holiday, sent shockwaves through Israel and the world. Hamas launched rockets into southern Israel and infiltrated Israeli territory. Fighters, many disguised as Israeli soldiers, wreaked havoc in Israeli communities. The speed and ferocity of the attack caught Israeli intelligence off guard. Videos showed Hamas fighters executing civilians, acts condemned as barbaric war crimes. The attack marked a turning point, hardening Israeli attitudes towards Hamas and making future dialogue seem remote. In the aftermath of the Hamas attack, Israel launched a swift retaliatory offensive on Gaza. Israeli warplanes and artillery targeted Hamas military installations and command centers. The IDF launched ground incursions, engaging in urban warfare with Hamas militants. The bombardment reduced neighborhoods to rubble, leaving a trail of destruction. Israel declared a state of war, mobilizing reserve troops and imposing a siege on Gaza. The heavy bombardment exacted a toll on civilians, raising concerns about the proportionality of the response. As the conflict raged in Gaza, a new front emerged along Israel's northern border with Lebanon. Hezbollah launched rocket attacks into Israeli territory, engaging in skirmishes with Israeli forces. Hezbollah's involvement raised the specter of a wider regional conflict. Israel now faced fighting on two fronts against determined adversaries. The opening of a second front increased the risk of miscalculation and escalation. The international community expressed grave concerns about the potential for a wider war. As the conflict entered its second week, Gaza plunged deeper into a humanitarian catastrophe. The relentless airstrikes and artillery fire have left the city in ruins, with entire neighborhoods reduced to rubble. Families are torn apart, and the sense of despair is palpable. The relentless bombardment and siege created a living hell for Gaza's residents. Homes, schools, and hospitals have been destroyed, leaving thousands without shelter. The constant fear of the next strike haunts every moment. The UN described the situation as catastrophic, with critical shortages of food, water, and medical care. Shelves in stores are empty, and the scarcity of basic necessities is pushing people to the brink of survival. Hospitals, overwhelmed with casualties, struggled to cope. Medical staff are working around the clock, but the sheer number of injured is beyond their capacity. Many are forced to treat patients in hallways and makeshift tents. The ICRC warned of a humanitarian disaster of colossal dimensions. Aid organizations are doing their best to distribute food and medical supplies, but the needs far exceed the available resources. The lack of electricity and clean water raised fears of a disease outbreak. People are forced to collect water from contaminated sources, and the risk of waterborne diseases is increasing daily. International aid organizations called for an immediate ceasefire and unimpeded access to provide aid. The global community is urged to act swiftly to prevent further loss of life and alleviate the suffering. The ongoing fighting hampered efforts to deliver aid on the needed scale. Aid convoys are often delayed or turned back due to the dangerous conditions, leaving many in desperate need without help. The situation remains dire, and the world watches as a humanitarian crisis unfolds. Amidst the horrors of war, a race against time to prevent a polio outbreak began. The conflict threatened to create a breeding ground for the virus, posing a grave threat to children. The first polio case in Gaza in over 2 decades was confirmed, highlighting the urgent need for vaccinations. WHO and UNICEF launched a mass vaccination campaign aiming to reach hundreds of thousands of children. The campaign faced logistical challenges and security risks, but represented a beacon of hope. The international community urged both sides to prioritize children's health and ensure safe passage for medical supplies. The outbreak of violence drew swift condemnation from the international community. World leaders called for an immediate ceasefire and a return to dialogue. The US expressed support for Israel's right to defend itself, but urged restraint. The EU condemned the disproportionate use of force in Gaza and called for an end to the blockade. The Arab world struggled to find a unified response, with some states intensifying diplomatic efforts. The UN Security Council held emergency meetings but struggled to reach a consensus. The deadlock underscored deep divisions within the international community over the conflict. Amidst the ongoing and often brutal conflict, a glimmer of hope for a negotiated solution emerged through the complex and delicate process of hostage diplomacy. This fragile hope was a beacon in an otherwise dark and tumultuous landscape. Hamas had taken Israeli civilians hostage, turning them into pawns in a high-stakes game of diplomacy. These innocent lives became bargaining chips, their fate hanging in the balance as negotiations unfolded. International efforts to secure their release intensified, with regional actors stepping in to mediate. Diplomatic channels buzzed with activity as envoys and negotiators worked tirelessly to find a resolution. The hostages' plight highlighted the profound human cost of the conflict. Families held vigils, protests erupted, and the emotional toll on those left behind was palpable. The world watched as the drama unfolded, hoping for a peaceful resolution. Israel faced intense pressure to secure the release of its citizens, while simultaneously dealing with mounting criticism for the civilian casualties in Gaza. The government was caught in a difficult position, balancing national security with humanitarian concerns. Hamas demanded significant concessions, including a prisoner exchange and the easing of the blockade on Gaza. These demands added layers of complexity to the already intricate negotiations. Israel engaged in indirect talks through intermediaries, seeking to secure the safe return of its citizens without compromising its principles. These secretive meetings were fraught with tension and uncertainty. The negotiations became a delicate dance between conflicting demands and principles. Each side weighed their options carefully, knowing that the stakes were incredibly high. The path to peace was fraught with challenges, but the glimmer of hope remained. The specter of Iranian involvement loomed large, raising fears of a wider regional conflict. Iran, a supporter of Hamas, had long provided financial and military support to Palestinian militant groups. Israel accused Iran of orchestrating the Hamas attack, pointing to Tehran's history of supporting terrorism. The potential for Iranian intervention raised alarms in Western capitals. The The US warned Tehran against escalating the conflict. The conflict highlighted the complex web of alliances and rivalries in the Middle East. The Israel-Hamas conflict sent shockwaves across the globe with far-reaching consequences. The conflict tested alliances, with the US reaffirming support for Israel while urging restraint. The EU struggled to find a unified response, torn between security concerns and the humanitarian crisis. The conflict underscored the influence of non-state actors in international affairs. Hamas demonstrated its ability to inflict significant damage and capture global attention. The global economy faced new challenges as oil prices surged amidst fears of a wider conflict. The conflict exacerbated religious tensions, with reports of anti-Semitic and anti-Muslim incidents increasing. As the guns fell silent, the task of rebuilding shattered lives began. The ceasefire offered a respite but did not address the underlying issues fueling the conflict. Achieving sustainable peace required addressing the root causes, including the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. It demanded a commitment to dialogue, compromise, and recognition of legitimate grievances. The path forward would be challenging, with deep mistrust and scars of war. However, the alternative, a perpetual cycle of violence, was unacceptable. The international community had a moral obligation to support the region in its quest for peace.